Once upon a time, before empires took over and influenced this nation, there was Tengrism. It was an ancient nature-focused monotheism where locals worshipped the sky, the mountains, and the sun. It was all about the nomadic life until about 751 CE. That's when the Battle of Talas happened. It was essentially a showdown between the Chinese Tang dynasty and the Arab Abbasid Caliphate. The Arabs eventually won, and that was the moment Islam started spreading around the region. But the real origin story of the Kyrgyz people hasn't started yet at this point. It all began in the 13th century. Originally, the ethnic Kyrgyz lived way up north by the Yenisei River in Siberia. Legend has it that they were the northern people with red hair, fair skin, and green eyes. They were masters of skiing and hunting. But as the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan started sweeping across Asia, these tribes migrated south to the Tian Shan, where they still live today. A few hundred years after that, the Kyrgyz people didn't know who they were or where they belonged. Because between the Mongol groups and the Chinese Qing dynasty, the line was a bit muddled. And to make it even more confusing, the Silk Road was happening, pumping more culture, DNA, and trade through the mountains. By the 1800s, other players decided to join in, and Central Asia basically became the board for the Great Game. Now don't let that name fool you, because it was anything but fun. In fact, it was a Cold War-style struggle for power. This time, between the Russian Empire from the north and the British Empire from the south. While that's happening, Kyrgyzstan was being harassed by the Khanate of Kokand, which is actually based in modern-day Uzbekistan. Naturally, they got tired of the Kokandians. That's why some Kyrgyz tribes asked for help from the Russians. And this, my friends, is where we meet one of the coolest figures in history, Kurmanjan Datka, also known as the Queen of the Alai. So, just a little backstory. After her husband was murdered in a coup, she took over as leader in 1862. Then, when the Russians moved in, she realised they couldn't be beaten, so she negotiated a peaceful transition to save her people from a bloodbath. By 1876, the Russians had fully annexed the area, which started out fine, until the settlers began taking the best grazing land for themselves. And I know it doesn't sound like that big of a deal to some of us, but when your whole life is based on nomadic herding, it is. The tension finally exploded in the 1916 Basmachi Revolt, which was met with a brutal crackdown that forced thousands of Kyrgyz to flee across the mountains into China. The year after that, the Russian Empire collapsed, and the Soviet Union moved in. Compared to the previous settlers, the Soviets were pretty big on organisation, hence they drew borders. But how do you draw borders for nomadic people who move with the seasons? That's the big question on everyone's minds. And the answer came in 1936, when they created the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. And to make that republic more clear-cut, the Soviets forced the nomads to settle in collective farms and built cities like Frunze, which is now called Bishkek. They also intentionally drew the borders in a zigzag manner, especially in the Fergana Valley, for one main reason: to leave large minority groups in different republics. That way, no one got too powerful or independent. And well, let's just say that didn't last very long. Because on August 31st, 1991, the Soviet Union folded and Kyrgyzstan finally became its own boss. But as it turns out, independence was hard. Their first president, Askar Akayev, started out as a great democratic hope, but eventually got caught up in corruption. So, in 2005, the people staged the Tulip Revolution and ousted him. Then they did it again in 2010. It was honestly a pretty rocky period in history, but hey, at least it led to one good thing. Rauza Otunbayeva became the first female leader of a Muslim-majority country in Central Asia, and the first to peacefully hand over power. Today, Kyrgyzstan is still finding its feet. We've seen more political shake-ups, like the rise of the current president, Sakhdir Japarov, in 2021, and some tough border skirmishes with Tajikistan. But through it all, the spirit of the 40 tribes remains strong. And if you've ever wondered what kind of landscape creates a people that tough, you're in luck, because that's what we're going to talk about next. Now, if you're a fan of heights, you're going to love this, because Kyrgyzstan is basically the rooftop of Central Asia. It's a landlocked nation spanning almost 200,000 square kilometres, or about 77,000 square miles. It's also tucked right into the centre of the Eurasian continent, sharing its borders with Kazakhstan, China, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. which explains its epic history. But unlike other nations bordered by flatlands or oceans, the borders of Kyrgyzstan actually follow the jagged crests of some of the highest mountains on Earth. Seriously. When I say mountainous, I'm not exaggerating here. Over 90% of the entire country is covered in peaks, from the Tian Shan to the Pamir Alai. But the highest point is legendary Pobeda Peak, also known as Mount Victory. It stands at over 7,400 metres, or about 24,000 feet. Compare that to the lowest point, Kara Dahria River, near the Fergana Valley, which is only about 132 metres, or 433 feet, above sea level. And you start to realise the sheer scale of the vertical drop across this nation. Because of that, you can experience 4 different climates. Down in the valley, you get hot summers and snowless winters. That's where you'll find the capital, Bishkek, along with the major agricultural hubs like the Chui. As you climb into the mid-mountain zone, the air gets fresher and the climate stays temperate, making it perfect for those virgin forests and the world's largest wild walnut groves. Now, once you hit the Alpine belt, things get pretty wild. The summers stay cool, hardly ever breaking 16 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And the winters are long and snowy. This is where you'll find nomads tending their high-altitude meadows, providing rich pastures for sheep, goats, horses, and even yaks. As you go up to the Nival belt, you'll find a world of rocks and snowfields and over 8,000 to 10,000 distinct glaciers. Yes, you heard that right. 8,000 plus glaciers, which work like the country's water bank. It holds an estimated 650 billion cubic meters of frozen water, which then feeds more than 40,000 rivers and streams, including the Narin River. Now, I can go on and on about how magnificent this country is, but if you ask me, nothing beats seeing it in person. So, if you're ready to witness these views for yourselves, I've linked the best flight and hotel deals in the description below to help you book your trip on a budget. And while we're talking about budget, would you like to know where Kyrgyzstan's budget stands right now? Let me tell you, it's actually pretty impressive. Back in 2024, Kyrgyzstan's GDP hit about $17.5 billion. But the icing on the cake was that it grew by a massive 9% that year. Now, if you're thinking that was just a lucky break, think again, because experts are predicting it'll climb even higher to 9.3% in 2026. That's great, right? But it wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for gold. Kyrgyzstan is home to the Kumtor gold mine, which is one of the highest and largest gold deposits on the planet. In fact, it's so massive an operation that in just the first 10 months of 2025 alone, they pulled in nearly $1 billion. And since gold prices are so high right now, the country has been able to stash away about $7 billion in reserves. That's enough to buy everything the country needs for the next 6 months. But you know what? Gold shouldn't get all the credit here, because the farmers are the ones keeping the country going day in and day out. How so? Well, agriculture provides jobs for about 1 out of every 3 people in Kyrgyzstan. They grow a lot of cotton and tobacco for export, yes, but they're also big on potatoes, veggies and sugar beet. So really, if there's anything sustaining the people, it'd be the farmers. Plus the ginormous water reserve they have. Remember when I talked about the glaciers? Yeah, they basically work as a giant water battery, because over 90% of the country's electricity comes from hydropower. In 2024, they churned out over 14,000 gigawatt hours of juice. But funnily enough, that's just 10% of what they could realistically produce. On top of that, they lose nearly half of their power to old leaky wires or people secretly tapping into their lines. So imagine what they could achieve without those hurdles in the way. Speaking of hurdles, for Kyrgyzstan, it's more than the untapped potential of their hydropower. It's also corruption and inflation. Prices for everyday items have been bouncing between 5% and 9%, which makes life feel a bit like a roller coaster for a normal family. Oh, and their currency, the som, stays pretty steady at about 89 per US dollar, but a lot of that stability depends on gold prices staying high. More than gold, though, Kyrgyzstan is shaped by its people, who are a mix of Russians, Uzbeks and over 80 other ethnic groups. But despite this, the heart of the country still beats with ancient nomadic traditions, starting with the yurt. These are portable, round tents that were invented to shelter families as they move about. They're made of a wooden frame, covered in thick layers of felt, which keeps things warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Inside those yurts, you'll find some of the most beautiful textiles in the world, and a lot of the designs you'll see are very much inspired by nature. Like the sheer darks, these are bold felt rugs with patterns that look like goat horns or mountain peaks. Then there's the tushkiis, which are incredibly intricate wall hangings that are often embroidered with flowers and plants for weddings. Besides those, there's also a style called kurak, which is where people sew together tiny scraps of fabric into blankets or hats. That's because they believe these scraps hold protective magic. So whoever's wearing the hat or using the blanket will be safe from whatever they're afraid of. And that's just the beginning. Because nomad culture is nothing without their horses. In this country, horses are more than simple animals. They're considered a man's wings, which honestly makes sense. Because when you think about it, horses provided transportation through rugged passes. They helped in wars. And in some instances, they have influenced the music. Pretty unusual, I know, but some traditional instruments were actually designed to be played while galloping. But that's not all. Their respect for horses extends to sports too, specifically cockburru. This is a high-speed version of polo played with a goat carcass instead of a ball. Sounds intense, right? Well, it's actually quite practical. See, playing a round of cockburru keeps the rider's reflexes lightning fast and ensures the horses stay incredibly strong and agile for whatever the mountains throw at them. But as cool as the sports are, the most mind-blowing part of the culture has to be the Epic of Manas. It's a really long poem that's been orally passed down for over 1,000 years. And just so you know how long this really is, it's 20 times longer than the Odyssey. It tells the epic tale of a hero named Manas who brought 40 different tribes together to form one nation. The people who tell this story are called Manaski, and these guys are legends. They can chant the story for hours, sometimes even days, without ever looking at a single page of a book. Can you do that? I know I can't. So now I'm curious. What's the longest passage you've ever memorized in your life? Is it a poem? A specific song? Maybe it's a quote from one of your favourite books. Whatever it is, let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.